Welcome to the Scaleup Valley podcast, where we bring the best of the best to help you scale your business from 1 million to 1 trillion. Today's guest is a special one. His name is Hsu Ken, the co-founder and managing partner at Iterative. Hsu Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Likewise. So I've been listening exhaustively to your podcast, the Iterative podcast. I really recommend it. So I know almost everything about yourself by listening to the podcast. I'm sure there is a lot of things that I don't know. But for the ones who didn't have the opportunity, who is Hsu Ken, and let us know a little bit more about yourself and what you are doing.
Sure. And thank you for listening to the podcast. That's kind of embarrassing. I still get a little embarrassed when people say they've listened to the things that we kind of record and stuff, which I feel like you're a pro now. You're probably used to lots of people listening to you, but I'm still new. So a little embarrassing, but thank you. I guess, my story, I'll start kind of like further back just because it gives context to kind of like what I'm doing now. So
right.
I'm originally from Malaysia. I was born in Penang. I moved to the US when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And then my parents had me do this thing where I would live in the US for 9 months and then live in Malaysia for 3 months. So every summer break in the US. So from the time I was 5 to about 18, we were doing this kind of back and forth thing. Early on, we also moved around a lot. So I think I went to like 8 different schools before I was 10. The reason being is my father he worked at Intel since the late 70s. And at one point he was Intel's fixer. So he worked in manufacturing and he went to the worst performing factory and fixed it. So every 9 months, it's like a new assignment. So we moved around a lot. I started 2 companies in the US. The first one was an early machine learning company in 2008. We ran the company for about 7 years. It was called Decide.com. We raised 16.5 million, which felt like a lot of money at the time, but with current seed stage and Series A investments, not so much, but it felt like a lot at the time.
Good
eBay
point.
Eventually bought the company.
2 or 3 years ago, it would be a lot of money.
I know, right?
So it's not only 10 years ago, it is kind of 2 or 3 years ago. Right?
Yeah.
But sorry to interrupt you. You were talking about
it's wild how much
company.
these amounts go up. But yes, so we raised 16.5 million. eBay bought the company 5 or 7 years later. So that was kind of my first experience with entrepreneurship. Brian is my other co-founder at Iterative. So we started that first company. We started a second company together called Weave. It's a professional networking company. We like to call it, if you're familiar with Lunch Club, it's like offline Lunch Club, like real life Lunch Club. Lunch Club is online. We went through YC. So we were summer 2014 when batches were, small enough where you could have everybody at YC and you had it in person and all that stuff. I think PG was still there. And then we ran that company for a few years and same kind of story, raised a couple $1 million, sold it for a few years later, much smaller deal. And then I took a year off and I traveled by myself. So I spent 5 months in Europe and I spent 7 months in Asia. And I think in the course of traveling around and kind of seeing other communities, especially startup communities and other areas, I got really excited about what was happening outside of San Francisco. So I moved to Singapore about 5 years ago, and then we started Iterative in March or February of 2020. So right as COVID was like happening. And Iterative is a YC style accelerator here in Southeast Asia. We only invest in Southeast Asia.
Awesome. That's really an amazing story. I knew a lot of the story, but I think for the ones who are following us, I think it's really inspiring, and congratulations in public for the amazing track records. That's great.
Thank you. I mean, a lot of luck goes into all this stuff, right? And a lot of people had to help in along the way, but thank you.
And by the way, of course, let us know a little bit more about Iterative, about your process, the way you kind of decide or select the companies that you guys work with, what are the benefits for founders in the area, etc.
Yeah. So look, Iterative, we started Iterative. I like to always say starting an accelerator was the last thing that I wanted to do. Especially in Southeast Asia. There's so many accelerators in Southeast Asia. I didn't want to be the 101st. But I felt strongly that the magic of YC was that it's run by, most of their partners are people who have started companies before, and so they're operators. And I think being a founder is such a unique experience that unless you've been one, it can be hard to kind of empathize. And if it's hard to empathize, then it's hard to help. And so we wanted to bring that to Southeast Asia. Other accelerators are great. Nothing wrong with that, right? But I think there's like a specific type of help that we wanted to kind of provide here in Southeast Asia. And so I think that's how we got started here. And our thesis for Southeast Asia was tons of opportunity. I actually think the founder raw materials are fantastic. I think people here are just as smart as anybody in Silicon Valley. And honestly, they're probably grittier. But we don't develop founders in Southeast Asia as well as we did in San Francisco. And I think that's going to change over time, honestly, with or without me. But if I can make it happen a little bit faster, then that's something that I'd like to do, especially since I'm from the region.
Right. So typically the companies that apply to be part of Iterative are at what stage?
Oh, actually, they're all over the place. We've invested in some, we invested in two guys that just graduated school and had no product. We've invested in some companies, with over $1 million in GMV. So it's kind of like all over the place. So yeah, I would say, if people are thinking about applying, we always tell people just apply. Right. Don't worry about stage. Don't worry about, just apply.
Right. And typically it's 150K check and 3-month program until demo day, but you explain much better than myself. I'm sure.
No, that's basically it. So it's 150,000 USD. It's a 3-month program. We spend the first 8 weeks basically trying to help you grow as quickly as possible. I can go into much more detail about that, but generally we try to help you grow as much as possible. And then the last month we run a fundraising bootcamp, which we actually just started on Monday for this current batch. And awesome. All of that is trying to transfer as much knowledge as we have about how to pitch your company, how investors actually think about investing, and how to do all of that.
Let's go into all those points for the ones who are thinking about starting up, and even for the ones, I think this is interesting in the trend that we discussed in our previous conversations. For the ones who are working on scale-ups and know exactly what to do in scale-ups, let's say from Series A to Series C, but are a little bit scared and feel that maybe it's the right timing to start up from the scratch a company, but going from 0 to 1 seems a little bit scary because they don't have the experience compared to going from 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, whatever it is.
Yeah, having kind of seen both sides of this, I think they're both scary. So, if you're scared at 0, if you're scared of 0 to 1, fair enough. If you're scared from 1 to 10, fair enough, right?
Exactly.
But I think you're scared for different reasons. 0 to 1, you don't know if you have something. And so what's scary about that is you're just taking a lot of risk on, is my idea good? Is this a problem that a lot of people have? Like, you're taking all of that risk, right? Going from 1 to 10, you probably, in Series A and beyond, you have some reasonable idea that this idea, like what you're working on, there's a business there, there's some people who need it. And I think for a lot of people, it comes down to 2 worries from 1 to 10. The first part is what you're doing big enough to kind of like get through kind of the later stages? So that's one thing. And how do you kind of expand out from there? So I don't know, geographically, products, whatever. Then the other question that a lot of these companies come into is, how do I make sure that I outcompete my competitors at that stage? If it is a big enough market, how do I make sure that I kind of like capture as much of the market as quickly as possible before other people kind of like come in, right? So there's a lot of execution that kind of comes with that. And typically at that stage, you need to be a professional kind of like manager, right? You can't just run around and meet with everybody. And so you need, real kind of roadmaps and real kind of financial controls and that kind of stuff. So happy to talk about whichever side that you think is helpful.
Absolutely. But I think for the ones who are listening to us, and I would say that the majority of our listeners are still in the US and Europe, but we have an interesting crowd in Southeast Asia, and that's why we are doing and running the Asian edition of the podcast with founders and operators in the region. But to give a flavor for the ones who are listening outside of Southeast Asia, and also for the ones from Southeast Asia that want to understand a little bit more about the US reality, as you have been living both, so what are the main differences and the main nuances that we should consider on starting up in both places? Let's say San Francisco, west coast of the US, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, a couple of things that are different and kind of like people should kind of consider, right? So the first part is how developed the markets is. Now, everybody knows about this. And so, but let me just be kind of like specific about it for maybe people in the US who don't know kind of like specifically what this means. I was once talking to a founder in Vietnam who wanted to start the Betterment or Wealth Front. So robo-advisor for Vietnam, right? So he came in and was like, oh yeah, we want to do this Wealth Front. And I was like, okay, cool. It sounds great. This has worked at other places. 3 months later, I talked to him and I was like, hey, how's that going? And they're like, oh yeah, we're not doing that anymore. And I said, well, why aren't you doing that? And he's like, well, I was looking to build the robo-advisor, but there wasn't even an online brokerage. So now we're working on the online brokerage, right? And so there's these kind of, sometimes I think people, if they're not familiar with the region, they come in and they're like, oh, we're going to do this thing. And you just have to realize that there's some like more structural things that need to be worked on. Again, Philippines, we invested in a company out there, but 70% of people in the Philippines have never had access to credit before. So no credit cards, loans. And so when I talk about kind of like the development differences, it's uneven, let's say. It's not like everything is uniformly kind of like less developed, right? In some areas, it's like very underdeveloped. Some areas, it's very overdeveloped. I find that like I live in Singapore now, I never take out my credit card. Everything is tapping and, and all that stuff. And the US is like so behind on that. So I think just, you have to kind of think about these differently. The other thing I would think about too is rules are just different. So the good example here is if you think about the US and how the real estate system works, there's an MLS system. And in Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia, there is no MLS. So there is no standardized repository of like residential listings. So that completely changes how prop tech works, right? So I think some of the built-in assumptions you have about kind of like how markets work, you have to reevaluate kind of from, Silicon Valley's favorite term, first principles, right? To kind of like reevaluate that. Practically, there's a few things too. So if you're starting a company here, you have to be a better manager faster. The reason is because salaries are just lower. And so these companies get bigger much faster. People in Southeast Asia raising a $5 million Series A can be 100+ person company. A $5 million round in the US is like kind of like a seed round maybe, or maybe like less. And it's like you have probably under 10 people. And so, managing a 10-person team in San Francisco and a 100-person team in Southeast Asia are very different. On top of that, if you're having 100 people, it's probably spread out across a couple different countries. And if it's spread out of different countries, then you need kind of infrastructure around, okay, I'm in Singapore, maybe I can run the Singapore office. What about the office in Bangkok? Who runs that? So, okay, we have country managers. Country managers are not a term that I remember ever hearing in the US because you just don't think about it, right? Then there's language differences. So I'm doing an all hands, but like maybe half of the people at the company don't understand what I'm saying. So there's all of this stuff you have to kind of work on. And so on some level, I think to found a company in Southeast Asia, you have to be a better like operator in these kind of like sense. So that's a thing that we have to kind of like work on. Another thing is international expansion or just market growth. Singapore has 5 million people. It's the smallest country in Southeast Asia, but a disproportionate number of startups get started here. You need to be able to expand past Singapore, right? So first 2 years maybe of you being around, you're going to have to start thinking about expansion. In the US, we sold a company to eBay and never had a conversation about going outside of the US, like never sniffed it, never came up, was never on an agenda. There's no point, right? There's plenty of market. And so I think, a lot of these areas you have to kind of be able to like break apart. So those are just a few. I'm happy to kind of talk more about them, but I think those are kind of the ones that come to mind.
That's a good point, and it makes me think about Europe and starting up from Portugal as well, with different languages, also a 10 million population country, and of course very different from the UK. A lot of the Portuguese founders try to scale into the UK and after into the US, or directly into the US. If it is already crowded in the US, they will try to go through European expansion. So typically UK or Spain or France or Germany. And again, it's a completely different world, as you said, with different languages, with country managers, a lot of complexity very early on. So we have that in common.
And I hear Latin America is kind of the same. So I hear that Southeast Asia, Europe, Latin America are kind of the same. Obviously, Europe a little bit more developed, but similar problems. Hey, what is the so in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is the crown jewel for expansion. Right. Indonesia, 300 million people, developing quickly, that kind of stuff. Is there one in Europe? What's the one that all the founders want to get into?
I think that's it's not in Europe. I think that all the European founders, the majority, 80%, would dream into going into the US. So it's outside of Europe. Okay. But for the ones who want to consider international expansion within Europe, I would say it would be clearly the UK, France, and Germany, if I'm not wrong. And then, of course, there is also a lot of scale-ups expanding into Southern Europe by Spain. So Italy, sorry for the ones who are listening from Italy, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated to penetrate into that market. So usually that's also one of the largest economies in Europe and one of the countries to consider. But I would say, short answer, definitely UK, and after UK, Germany and France, and after that, Spain and Italy as the main economies in Europe.
So I'm curious. I'm just curious of Europe. I don't know that much about European kind of startups. Why did they want to go to the US? Because Southeast Asia, also a lot of the startups want to go to the US. And I wonder if it's the same reason.
I think it's the same reason. And that's what you already explained it before about the US. It's really the size of the market and much less complexity in order to scale. So we see that companies, in order to scale up in Europe, might need 5+ years in order to get to the same size as you get in the US, given the complexity that they will face. So in that sense, that's why there is the American dream also in Europe, let's say. But the good thing is that definitely US investors are also coming into Europe and are also tapping opportunities into Europe. And there are some specific markets that it makes much more sense to stay in Europe than going into the US. But a lot of founders consider it, even starting almost from day one in the US, depending on what is the industry that they are attacking, if it might make more sense East Coast or West Coast for them. And keeping product and engineering in Europe, also to be able to compete, as you said, in terms of the cost of talent, which is still very, very competitive in some European countries compared into the East Coast or even the West Coast in the US.
I know for Southeast Asia, all of those things are the same. They also care about the prestige.
Exactly.
There's something about kind of like, if you are recognized in the US as a startup, that like means something, which, we can debate on whether that actually should mean anything, but there's a bit of that.
And it's curious because it also happens, let's say, in some European countries, if you are able to prove in the US that it works, then it would be much easier to expand even in Europe. So, which is kind of crazy, but that's kind of the reality. But also it depends on the country. For instance, Portugal is a very open country to what comes from outside. There are other countries in Europe that are a little bit more, believe more, trust more in products that come from inside the country. So it really depends on the culture of each country. And again, what happens in the US, some countries allow founders to stay a lot of time in those countries because the markets are relatively big, not so big as the US, and that's why there is always a dream. But anyway, 80 million people in Germany, 66 or something in France, also 60 million in the UK. So there are considerable markets to explore before expanding into a second market in that case. And let's go into what are the main differences that you see in terms of the culture of VCs and investors in both regions.
This is a sometimes hotly debated topic, and so I'll try to wade in mindfully. So I think the biggest differences are the ecosystem are in different stages of kind of development, right? I think San Francisco is kind of like in the latest stage, and I would argue probably China is kind of in that stage now too. And what I mean by that in how this practically matters is a lot of investors in San Francisco have seen the companies like grow really big. They've made a lot of money in through these exits. And so that's happened several times. That has made investors in Silicon Valley both rich and risk tolerant, right? Mm-hmm. So, they were around when Mark Zuckerberg came through Sand Hill Road and kind of like did his pitches, and everybody was like, who's this guy in pajamas, right? And then it turns out it's Mark Zuckerberg, right? So I feel like every investor who did their pitches in pajamas for the next 9 months after that probably got invested, because for all the people who kind of, missed out on that one. And so they're just they're looking for risk. So maybe one thing that I think about a lot is, I'm a math guy, I studied math in school. So there's this notion of expected value. So expected value is defined as probability of success multiplied by magnitude of success. Silicon Valley is all about magnitude of success. They don't care that much about probability of success. If you walk in there and you say, hey, I'm going to do this thing. If I'm right, it changes the world, but there's a 1% chance that I'm right. And if somebody else walks in and says, hey, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to make the world incrementally better, but I'm 50% right, they're going to invest in the first one every time, right? Southeast Asia investors, I think they care a little bit more of probability of success. They're a little bit more afraid of losing money. And look, fair enough. There hasn't been as many exits here. Their LPs and Asian LPs tend to be a little bit more risk averse. The idea of having their money tied up in venture capital funds for the next 7 to 9 years, venture capital funds are 95% of the time wrong, and those businesses are going to zero. It's a lot to swallow, right? Now it's easy in the Valley because they can point to, I got into Google and all this stuff. And so I think LPs are like, yeah, I get it. I've seen lots of people make money off of this, but Southeast Asia that hasn't happened yet. I think it will happen. So this risk tolerance thing, I think, is kind of like different, right? And oh, by the way, if you think about expected value, it's almost impossible to 10x your probability of success, but you can like 100x your magnitude of success, right? So you have, I don't know, a 20% chance of being successful. You can't 10x 20%, right? Mathematically cannot be done. You probably are never sniffing anything above 50% anyway, because startups are like, there's no way that a startup has a 50% chance of success. There's just no way. So even if you're at 20%, maybe the best you can do is you can double. Best, right? But magnitude of success, you can 1,000x, 10,000x, that kind of stuff. And so I think maybe I come from that ecosystem. And so I think a little bit more on that. But we often ask ourselves less about what are all the ways that this doesn't work, and more about if this is if this actually works, like how big of an impact can that be? So I think there's some differences here between the two parts.
Definitely a great explanation. I love the magnitude. I never heard this explanation. I think it's simply brilliant to and even for the ones who are thinking about if I should go with this idea or that idea, it might be also a good criteria to help us have that debate on the ideation process, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. I think we didn't think about that when we first were starting companies, but if I was starting companies again, I would literally go through my list of ideas and I would score on these two things and try to find the thing that had the highest like score, right, between the two. Yeah. But I would probably weight magnitude more.
Absolutely. I think I translated it recently about a conversation also about my own career. Is when you have high risk, you need to have a potential high return. It doesn't make any sense to have high risk and not have the potential of high return. So I think that was a very interesting lesson to me personally to really understand that it's okay to be risky, but at least as you said, we need to be able to have a high magnitude of success if that happens, right?
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. Another way to kind of like think about this, I just see this pop up every once in a while, is I forget who did this, but somebody won a Nobel Prize, I think in economics or something, for he wrote a paper on modern portfolio theory. So this is what all the robo-advisors use. And his whole point was, if you are taking more risk, you should be compensated for taking more risk. So the whole way that you build a portfolio is don't take risk unless you're compensated for it, because that makes absolutely no sense, right? So only take risk when you are fairly compensated for it. And so I think it's just another version of kind of like what you're talking about.
Love it. So let's go into the insights about starting up a company again, and those initial stages. About how to identify the best idea to start with. So what are some of your tools and frameworks to help companies to go through the ideation stage?
Yeah, so I think if we start from the very beginning, and look, there's many ways to do this, and any type of story we want to tell, we can find some founding story that like worked this way. In our experience, the mythical notion that you were sitting around somewhere and you had some brilliant idea and it came fully formed in your head is kind of rubbish. I don't know any founder where that was the case, right? Famously, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was working on Facebook, in the first 2 years, I think spent 6 months working on a completely different product because he didn't think that Facebook was going to be that big of a deal. He was working on this P2P sharing company. And so I just don't think these things come fully formed. So, maybe for your listeners, if they're sitting out there and they're being like, oh, I want to start something, but I just don't have an idea, and they're hoping to be struck by lightning, you might go a very long time hoping to be struck by lightning. What practically happens is you need to get in the game. So what I mean by this is don't overthink it early on. And what I mean by this is like, just start working on anything that you think is useful to like some small group of people, right? So the first step for us is, this doesn't have to be a world-changing idea necessarily. I mean, hopefully it does, and you can kind of indulge yourself in this, but oftentimes just start with, is there some group of people who need the thing that I'm building? And if you can get that small group of people, then we can go figure out if there's more of those people. The other thing that we typically suggest to people is be obsessed with the problem, not the solution.
Right.
All businesses, startups, restaurants, anything, all businesses exist to solve people's problems. If you don't solve anybody's problems, you're not going to be in the business for very long. The solution changes all the time, right? And so we tend to look for founders, and we suggest to founders, hey, go look for problems. And then you can be creative about how you kind of like work on those solutions. And honestly, most of the startups that we work with, the first year they work on a problem, they probably come at it from like 6 or 7 different angles, right? So I think aligning around a problem is like a really important thing. And sometimes those problems are obvious and sometimes they're not. Maybe the mindset that I would suggest everybody get into is don't assume that the way the world is the way it should be or that it has to be. Mm-hmm. I think this is a big difference for a lot of people sometimes. My favorite example of this is I think most people, when they sit in traffic, they're like, traffic. This is what we all experience, right? And you just kind of resign to it, right? And I think an entrepreneur kind of sits down and is stuck in traffic and just gets so upset. They're like, this doesn't have to be the case. How do I eliminate traffic forever?
There's a better way.
There's a better way. Why are we all sitting in cars, at this light waiting, right? And look, maybe some of it is kind of like, you can, okay, if we're breaking down this idea, which I've thought about sitting in traffic before, it's ridiculous how much space is between all of us waiting in line because we're all sitting in our own cars and all this stuff, right? So, okay, can you kind of group people? Can you do all this stuff? Should people take less cars? Should they do? But the point being is like, don't assume that the world has to be this way, right? I think an entrepreneur's job is you go out into the world, you say, hey, this sucks. Right. How do I make this better for everybody? Right. And so you kind of want to have that mindset. You start pulling on that thread and you can kind of like go down. So lots of things we can kind of unpack with how to look, but maybe those are kind of like good places for people to start.
Right. And I think that at this stage is really all about problem solution fit before thinking about product market fit and later on go to market fit. Right.
Yeah. And maybe I'll share one story of how this really made all the difference for us. Experimentation is really important because and maybe your listeners are much smarter than me, but like I couldn't sit in a room by myself and come up with the next big idea. I just couldn't do it. And so we experimented a lot. And what I mean by this is when we started our first company, before we came about with the actual idea that eBay eventually bought, we made a rule. Every week we met on Monday. And during that meeting, we decided whether we were going to spend another week on the idea we had just worked on the previous week, or whether we were going to work on a new idea. The only rule with starting a new idea is it needed to be released the following week. No exceptions, right? And the thing that was good about this was a few things. One, we got really good at building MVPs because we only had a week. And I think the reality is, which was painful for all of us being technical, was writing software is actually not the fastest path to releasing. It's doing stuff manually, which PG has a whole thing about kind of like, do things that don't scale. But it's the same idea. Software just helps you scale. That's all software does, right? But if you want to do things quickly and you want to be very nimble about it, just do it yourself. Open up a spreadsheet and like you can do a lot of stuff. And the other thing it did for us is we debated so much less. So we got into this 1 week cycle because we had spent the previous 18 months debating our grand idea only to launch it and nobody cared, right? Because we didn't talk to any customers and we didn't experiment and we didn't do any of that stuff. So instead of debating, like if you and I were going to start a company and we were going to release in a year, you and I are going to debate so much about what we release and how it should work and all of that stuff. And we did that. And it turns out all of that time was basically wasted anyway, because none of us knew what we were talking about and nobody cared about it anyway. When we did these 1 week cycles, all the debating stopped because look, it was just a week. Like, you might have an idea. I might hate your idea. I might be like, I think that's a dumb idea, but you know what? I'll make a deal with you. Let's do your idea this week. And then next week, let's do my idea. So we just, instead of having several hour debates about stuff, we just started building stuff and launching it and then kind of like seeing how the market reacted to stuff. So I think that was kind of the key. That's how we ended up with the first company and the idea that we worked on there. So I would suggest that people kind of like debate less, kind of like experiment more
and talk more with the
talk more with customers. Yes.
Right. So that this is really, really important and easy to forget, even for the most experienced.
I agree.
And later on, so of course, creating the deck and being ready for raising a pre-seed round. So what do you think that founders should do in order to be ready to go into that stage? So after having the first idea and maybe running through those one cycle weeks on experimentation, they find, okay, this is an idea and this is a problem that worth our time to work on. There is a probability and the magnitude of success that marry the opportunity. And so it's time for us to go raise a round to be able to work more on this and get into the next step, which would be the seed stage. So how do we build a deck?
Yep. So I would say the first thing I would ask founders is, are you sure you want to do this? And what I mean by that is, if you raise money from VCs, you are now going to be working on this for the next 5 to 7 years of your life, if you're lucky. And that's a real thing, right? So I feel like I have some founders who are like, they kind of just wanted to start a startup. They didn't love the idea. And then they're 4 years in and they're just like, oh man, I got to like work on this idea, even though I see much better ideas, right? So first step, if you're going to take people's money, that's a commitment. You're going to have a responsibility to them. Make sure you are ready to kind of like honor that commitment, right? So, okay, let's say that you are. Mm-hmm. We just did this with our batch, so this is very fresh in my mind. We think of these first pitches in 2 ways. First, there's a story element to the pitch, and there's a traction element to the pitch, right? So the story element is, what is the change you're bringing about the world, and why is this going to be such a big idea? And you're talking about magnitude of success, right? Most of it. Right. Traction is, do you have evidence? Traction is evidence that what you're saying is probably right. So, you can think about it this way. If I'm pitching you a company and I have this fantastic story about how I'm going to change the world, but I can't get any customers, you're going to be like, oh, that's a great story. I just don't think it's true, because if it was such a great story, why don't you have a bunch of customers, right? Exactly. And then there's some pitches where they have a lot of traction, but they don't have a very good story. So, okay, they may have a fair bit of customers, but they can't articulate why this is going to be such a big thing. So if you think about traction and story as a 2x2 kind of like matrix, you obviously want to have very good story, very good traction. Right. You obviously don't want to have bad traction, bad story. The other 2 quadrants are interesting. So we find that if you have good traction and a bad story, you may be able to fundraise, but your valuation is going to be quite low, right? Investors are basically like, look, I just don't think the magnitude of success here is going to be that big, so I'm just not going to invest at a higher valuation. Okay. The other quadrant, which is low traction, high story, it really depends. We've seen some startups raise at pretty high valuations because the story is so good and so compelling that they think that the traction is going to kind of like happen at some point. They're just trying to figure it out. The US tends to love to invest in those much more than Southeast Asia. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but you can kind of think about like, how good is your story? How good is your traction? And that's like a pretty decent place to kind of like start, I think.
Got it. And how do you describe of course, then we could go into much more detail, and we don't have enough time.
Slide by slide,
etc. But going a little bit quicker through these initial stages from 0 to 1, let's say what we need to prove from pre-seed into seed, or what do we need to prove in order to raise the next round successfully.
Got it. Yep. So I think in order to raise your pre-seed round, you need to have a thesis about your market. You're like, hey, I think this is going to be a big deal for these reasons. And you need to have a thesis. And I specifically say thesis because you're not going to have figured it all out at that point. So you need to have a thesis, and you need to have some amount of traction to give evidence that your thesis is probable, at least, right? Seed round, in order to raise the seed round, you need to have a fair bit of evidence that like your thesis is in fact true, right? So you need to have obviously more traction, but maybe more than that, you need to figure out what the levers are. And what I mean by levers is, have you figured out who your target market is? And be specific about it. I think sometimes I hear founders when they say the target market is, 21 to 27 year olds. And I'm like, okay, so it's a lot of 21 to 27 year olds in the world, right? Like, what are we talking about? And the more specific you can be, the better. And even better than that is if you can talk about how you are going to acquire different market segments. So I'm going to acquire 21 to 25-year-olds in Singapore who are college educated for this reason, because they feel this problem acutely. I'm going to get all of them. Okay, once I get them, I'm going to go into this other group. Okay, then once I get them, I'm going to, so investors can kind of see how your market is going to grow. So I think pre-seed, you hopefully have figured some of that out, but not that much. At seed, you really need to kind of figure it out. Seed to Series A is when you really need to prove that you can hit the gas, right? And you need to prove enough that this is a real business. So maybe it was okay if you were growing fast from pre-seed to seed and you can raise money off of that. But if you're getting to Series A and you don't have clear revenue and that kind of stuff, I think that's going to be challenging. Especially in the macro environment we're all about to start heading into. I think you're going to see a lot of later stage investors suddenly care a lot more about burn and unit economics and revenue and clear path and all that stuff. So the heydays of kind of like just grow, spend as much money as possible, we might see a slowdown here on that one.
Got it. That's an amazing summary in such a short period of time. Well done, Hsu Ken. I've thrown you I'm sure a lot of challenges and say we have not so much time now, and you were able to summarize it very, very, very well. So any other tips that you would like to share for the ones, and we discussed this in the beginning of the show, we are seeing this trend, even for the ones who are now professional about looking into ideas. So I think that there are two kinds of entrepreneurs that I'm seeing. The traditional one, which is the one, as you said, that is facing that hurdle, that pain, and believe that it should be a better way to solve that problem because they feel it, the pain themselves, and they start realizing there are a lot of people in the world who feel the same kind of problem, and they solve that problem by purpose. And there are now what I call more the professional entrepreneur, that is the one who is kind of searching ideas all over the world. And maybe that idea might make more sense to launch in Southeast Asia or in Latam than in the US or Europe. And they are ready to say, look, I will go into Southeast Asia and launch this idea. And this is the right timing for the market. Also the why now kind of slide. So any other tips to consider for the ones who are starting up from scratch in the first angle or the second angle?
Yeah, and this is not what you asked, but just a comment on those two types.
It's perfect.
We all wish we were the first one, but the reality is kind of like, sometimes we don't all kind of like work on problems that we kind of face ourselves, right? So we all wish we were the first one. It's easier because then you're just solving a problem you have. You still should do customer development, but you just understand it so well, right? A lot of people have been very successful being the second group. So if you feel like you're in the second group, you're not cheating, you're not disingenuous, like it's fine. But the thing you need to remember is if it's not a problem that you have, you need to spend a lot more time understanding the problem and internalizing those users so that you can go work on that problem, right? So I think the first thing I would probably say to people is be very clear on which group you are and then act accordingly, right? So I think that's a key difference kind of like between those two groups.
Got it. Love it. So let's go into the quick question and answer part of the show to wrap up. So if you would have an opportunity to have a coffee with your younger self, let's say at the beginning of Iterative, what advice would you offer to your younger self?
Oh, beginning of Iterative.
Yes.
Oh.
Or would you prefer to go into the beginning of your first or second venture? You decide.
I'll do both. I'll do quick ones. Awesome. Iterative, I would probably say hire faster. I think we just got really busy into kind of working on stuff, and I think we just hired too slow. So Iterative, as of 3 months ago, was just Brian and I, and now it's 4 of us, and I just think we were much too slow, which is a classic kind of startup problem. So if it was talking to myself earlier on, I'd just be hire a little bit faster, stop stop trying to hero, do everything, right?
Exactly.
Which I think a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, kind of have this problem.
Although that's,
if I was talking to my younger self, let's say the person before the first company when we're kind of like starting out and that kind of stuff, I think the thing I would tell myself is, I don't know if this is going to be useful to people, enjoy it a little bit more. I was so impatient to get somewhere and do something and all of that. I wish I enjoyed it a little bit more. I have very kind of like fond memories of those times. But when I think back of it, it's like, I just wanted to get through it as quickly as possible. And I kind of wish I can never get those times back. And I kind of wish that, I kind of like stopped a little bit more to kind of like enjoy kind of what we were doing rather than like, okay, we raised this fund, we got to raise the next one, we got to do this, and we got to get acquired, and we got to do that. Like, look, just enjoy it, right? Yeah, like less check, right? And more like, this is a really fun experience. It was I was 22, 23 when we started. I spent my entire 20s in it, and those were like fun times. So I don't know, maybe not helpful to your viewers, but if they're going through it, take more photos and enjoy it a little bit more.
I believe so, and even for the ones who are in your 20s, enjoy a lot.
Enjoy it.
And leverage the opportunity.
Yep.
So, what are you the most proud of on your entrepreneurial journey so far?
I think a lot of people will be like, "Oh, is it selling companies and raising funds?" And honestly, it's not any of those things. I think I feel like all this stuff is, I don't know how useful it is. I'm really proud that we've done business the way that I think business should be done. There's a lot of, if you kind of work long enough, there's a lot of opportunities where you can take some shortcut and screw somebody. It's easier to do something that is different than what you said you were going to do. And I feel like I kind of like have a fair bit of peace and sleep well at night knowing that like, in all these situations, we kind of did the right thing. And so I think, I don't know, I'm kind of proud of that. I think it matters less to me kind of like where we get and more like, I'm a big process person. So doing things the right way kind of matters to me. And so I think I'm always proud of that.
It seems simple, but for the ones who are listening, yes, follow your values and be loyal to the culture of the company. But when you are in high pressure situations, and when doing the wrong thing might help you to go into the next stage, and doing the right thing might make it a little bit more difficult, that's when we see if we are really at the level that we wish we were, right? And that's why I'm saying I really empathize with you.
Yeah,
it's always great to do the right thing, but we only know when we are there.
and actually, maybe I'll say one thing. It is great to do the right thing. You'll feel good about yourself, that kind of stuff. I also think it's the right business thing to do. Yeah. If you think about, especially in the startup ecosystem, it's a very long game. I'm 39 now, so I've been doing it for 18 years. Like, it's a long game.
Exactly.
You're going to work with these people. You're going to run into them for a long time. If you kind of cross people kind of like too early on, people aren't going to want to work with you. And I think the more you're in it, I think the less your opportunities are going to be. So both morally good, but also I think makes good business sense.
Good business sense. Kind of the Warren Buffett, it takes a life to build a reputation.
There you go.
And a minute to hurt the reputation, or to break the reputation, let's say. Worst advice ever received?
We were joking about this before we got on this call. I apologize, Dad. I might throw you under the bus here a little bit. When I graduated from college, my father, who was an immigrant, all he wanted was stability for his kids. He moved to America, and so he really wanted me to take like very normal, typical corporate job. And I told him I was going to start a startup, and he said, "What does the startup do?" And I said, "I don't know." And then he said, "What do you know about starting startups?" And I said, "Not very much." And he said, "How much are you going to get paid?" And I said, "Well, we don't have any money." And he was like, "Crazy. What are you doing?" like I don't understand, right? And so I think, and look, he's obviously a parent, and so these are kind of the right questions to kind of ask. But I think I'm glad I did not listen to him on that one.
And now you can explain him the importance of the magnitude of success.
Well, I think what's funny now is he gave a talk for the Malaysian government about the importance of startups and entrepreneurialism or something like that. And I was like, I was in the back. I was like, where was this when I was telling him that I wanted to do this?
Favorite business book?
Okay, so this one is not necessarily a book, but I want to shout this out to everybody. Because this was like seminal to me when I first started. If you Google P. Marsa blog, it is Mark Andreessen's early blogs from the early 2000s. He actually took them from he removed them from his website, but they were so seminal that everybody, like people have reposted it and stuff. But he writes these like 10 short essays about how to think about startups. And it is a collection that I revisit several times a year, just to kind of like relook at it and that kind of stuff. Mark Andreessen, of course, of Andreessen Horowitz is kind of like a famed entrepreneur and investor. And so they're very candid posts. And so I think if you haven't seen those before, I would highly recommend. So I apologize, not a book, but still hopefully
that's
helpful.
A great one. And by the way, for the ones who are not familiar with the expression that Hsu Ken used it during the show, PG means Paul Graham at Y Combinator, the famous founder of.
Yes. His essays are also fantastic. They're like the gospel in Silicon Valley. So if you want to do that too. So,
for the ones who are outside the region and are not aware. Favorite movie or series?
Oh my gosh. That is tough. I don't know about favorite. I just finished Billions last night, the new season. Have you seen this? Have you seen Billions before?
Not yet, but that's the one who is in my list. That's why.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't say. It kind of makes me want to be a hedge fund, like run a hedge fund or something like that, just because it seems cool, and I'm sure it's a dramatization. But it's a great show. It's a lot of fun, even if the characters are kind of like the worst of humanity. Right. So I don't know if it's my favorite, but I quite enjoy it.
We kind of enjoy the angle and the thought process, even if we don't follow it. So favorite podcast, of course, excluding this one.
It's this one. It's definitely this one. After this one, I get a lot of value from maybe I would say two. The Andreessen Horowitz podcasts are very kind of like deep. And so what I think that's interesting about those is they talk a lot about spaces, about specific spaces and where they think technology is going. That's interesting. But I think the more interesting thing is how do they think about spaces, I think is actually interesting. So I listen to those not to be educated on the space, but to see how they talk about it and what kind of like mental frameworks they use to kind of like look at those to see if I can kind of like borrow and mimic from some of that. So I think those are good. And then I listen to Ben Thompson from Stratechery's podcast quite a lot. I'm a big Stratechery fan. It's this paid newsletter that he's been writing for years, but it's famed in Silicon Valley as in CEOs of publicly traded companies will read some of his analysis and change their like own kind of like roadmaps because of that. So if people aren't familiar with that, that's quite good too.
That's a great point. Hsu Ken, thanks so much for making the time. It was a lot of fun to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully this was helpful for people.
Absolutely. And we would love to, as you saw, to have shared much more than what we were able to share. But we are sure that there was a lot of value delivered in this show. We keep bringing you the best of the best to make your life a little bit easier, starting up and scaling up your company. See you soon and keep scaling.